Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Can I ask you to take your seats, please? Well, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the 12th Annual Mates David and Hannah Stahl Memorial Lecture in Bioethics. My name is Peter Armenta, and I am the Dean at Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. On behalf of the school, I'd like to thank Dr. Ted Stahl for his vision and his commitment to the issue of bioethics here at the medical school. This important lecture encourages thought-provoking and meaningful dialogue among our students, faculty, staff, as well as the community. And I think you can see that today with the number of people here from all over Central Jersey and beyond. Another person deserving of recognition today is our speaker, Dr. Camara Phyllis Jones, who is Research Director on Social Determinants of Health and Equity in the Division of Adult and Community Health at the National Center for Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. In addition, I'd also like to thank Bob Like, our chair of the advisory committee for the Stahl Lecture, and the committee, along with the individuals and organizations who have donated so generously to this program. Through your ongoing efforts, we're building a firm foundation of endowed lectureships, fellowships, and professorships for Robert Wood Johnson Medical School as it continues to grow and advance to the nation's top tier of academic medical centers. Just last week, for those of you who were here, know that we presided over Match Day when our graduating medical students found out where they will perform their residencies. I'm proud to tell you that we had a 97% rate of matching, topping the national rate of 93%. This apparently was the best match in the history of our school. In addition, one of our students also received an award from the American Medical Association, and I'm happy to report that our board scores for the first step, part one of the boards, were just tremendous. It was quite a nice day for the dean. I almost didn't come to work the next day. It was so nice. The Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences Institute received a score which topped all other submissions for their center grant. And it's just tremendous accomplishment over the last several months and weeks. Again, many exciting things are happening on the campus as we prepare to graduate our next class of exemplary students. Before our speakers begin, I do want to turn the rostrum over here to Dr. Ted Stahl, again, whose vision, perseverance, and support made this lecture possible. Ted?
Thank you, Dean, and thank you all for coming today. And I especially want to thank Dr. Like and all who worked on organizing this lecture. Jeanette Evans, Patricia Hansen, Jennifer Forbes of the Department of Communication and Public Affairs, Tammy Hajalapain of UMG&J Foundation, and Diana Palmer for the CME credits. Over the past 12 years, these lectures have dealt with important issues in bioethics and thereby have confirmed the basis for establishing this lectureship. That this lectureship in bioethics would best reflect who my parents were, the foundations of their beliefs, and the values they transmitted to me. The lecture today is very much of that tradition. And the subject gives me the opportunity to speak about a particular episode concerning my parents. I grew up learning that it was important to combat social injustice. I'm afraid I did something. Hey, that's better. It was important that I learned about this because it was important to my parents because of their encounter with social injustice, described in part in the note in your program. And even more importantly, because of the singular emphasis on social justice in the Jewish tradition. I was taught by word and deed. And I might encapsulate that teaching by describing that episode, my bar mitzvah experience, which occurred much more than a few years ago, but I remember it very well. As part of the bar mitzvah service, I, as do all other bar mitzvahs, read the Haftorah, a portion from the prophets. In my case, I read a portion of the prophecy of Amos. And I might say that I was very happy that portion was a short one. I was prepared for the service not only by our rabbi, but even more by my father. My father was a very learned man in Hebrew and in our religion. He taught me how to chant the Haftorah, and he was a very, very rigorous taskmaster. He taught me Amos and his special place in our tradition. We had quite a few discussions about Amos's prophecies and how significant they were. My mother was a vigorous participant in those discussions. Amos prophesied in the mid-800s BCE. He is seen by scholars as the first of the literary prophets, although he describes himself as a sheep tender. Amos condemned with great ferocity the cities of Israel and surrounding countries for their terrible treatment of the poor, vulnerable, and the needy. He speaks passionately with great and striking imagery against those who live in luxury and who defraud the poor and rob the needy, and describes the punishment that they will receive. At the end, however, he holds out hope for restoration. His words are familiar to all of us. They have rolled down through the centuries. Leaders of social movements have turned to Amos to express their outrage and their hopes of bringing about change. David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, and famously, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. We all know the phrase, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." Amos's call for justice is still heard and is as relevant today as it was over 2,000 years ago, and I believe relevant to our lecture today. For me, Amos is special not only for his prophecy, but because when I read Amos, I hear the voice of my father. When harking back to that bar mitzvah, I should say that my mother, in addition to participating in our discussions, of course, arranged for the party and the food that came after the service. In that vein, I can commend you to the reception after the lecture. Thank you. And I call on Bob Light to introduce our speaker.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. And I'd like to thank Dina Menta and Dr. Ted Stahl and all of the members of the Planning Committee for helping us to put on this program today, and also to thank Dr. Russ McIntyre, who was previous chair of the Bioethics Advisory Committee, so we can build on the important work that's taken place over the past 12 years. We're extremely honored and excited to have Dr. Camara Jones as our 12th Stahl Biomedical Ethics Lecturer. She's taken a day of leave from her position to present to us this afternoon. And Dr. Amenta has already introduced her briefly. I'd like to say a little bit more, and her impressive bio sketch is in your handout. Dr. Jones is nationally and internationally known for her seminal work in the area of addressing inequalities in health and healthcare, and the need to confront and challenge various forms of racism. Dr. Jones received her medical degree from Stanford University, completed residencies in general preventive medicine at the Johns Hopkins School of Health and Hygiene and Public Health, and her family medicine residency in social medicine at Montefiore Hospital, where I believe she also worked with Dr. Denise Rogers, who will be coming down, I understand, this afternoon as well. She earned a master's degree in public health and a doctoral degree in epidemiology at Johns Hopkins. She's a well-published scholar and dynamic speaker who has received numerous awards. Most recently, she spent 9 months in New Zealand as an Ian Axford Fellow in Public Policy. She's held numerous leadership and advisory positions, including several in the American Public Health Association, and has served as president of the Society for Analysis of African American Public Health Issues. She's also a member of the board of directors of the American College of Epidemiology. And for those of you who may have seen the PBS series on unnatural causes, she was featured on this very important program that is bringing together communities around the country to address issues of inequalities. Before I turn the program over to her, I'd like to make just also a few comments to build on Dr. Stahl's very eloquent personal statements. Given the national dialogue about healthcare reform that's beginning and our own efforts here in New Jersey, the topic Dr. Jones is speaking on achieving social justice in health and healthcare is extremely timely and relevant. Indeed, as we enter the upcoming holiday season for Passover, for Easter, for all the different religious traditions, it is critical that we ask questions and raise our collective consciousness about how together we can mend our troubled nation and world. In this regard, I offer the following 3 meditations, quotes, that speak to the need for us to wake up, to recognize our brokenness, as well as our assets and strengths, and to take concerted and committed community action. And I think we will hear these resonate throughout Dr. Jones's presentation. I'm reminded of the powerful writing of Elie Wiesel, writer, Holocaust survivor, who once said, "The opposite of love is not hate, but indifference." We need to wake up. We need to learn about the disparities and inequalities that exist. And we're trying to do that through our education of medical students here, residents, and ourselves, but it's also about educating the community. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. also wrote, "Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Even a superficial look at history reveals that no social advance rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals." And we will hear of Dr. Jones's work that she is exactly that kind of advocate par excellence. And finally, from our own Rabbi Yaakov Hilsenroth here in Highland Park. I don't know if the Rabbi's here. No. Rabbi, I use your wonderful quote for so many years, and it's a quote that resonates with many religious traditions. Sometimes it's easier to change the world than to change oneself. And so it starts with us as individuals, our families, our communities, our organizations. So in Deuteronomy it says, "Justice, justice shalt thou pursue. Justice, justice shalt we pursue." Please help me welcome Dr. Camara Jones.
Good afternoon, and it is my distinct pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dean Amenta. Thank you, Dr. Stahl, and thank you, Dr. Like, for your introductions. And thank all of you all for coming. I am going to, I've taken a day of leave from my position at CDC to come and do this lecture. And I'm going to be talking about achieving social justice in both health and healthcare by knitting together 2 streams of thought. The first is going to be on social determinants of health and social determinants of equity. What are they? And then picking up on racism as a particular social determinant of equity, talking about naming and addressing the impacts of racism on health. In our discussion on social determinants of health and social determinants of equity, let's start out by looking at levels of health intervention. So here we are, whoops, boom. Somebody has just fallen off of the cliff of good health. And if that's you or somebody in your family, you would be delighted if there were an ambulance there at the bottom of the cliff to pick you up and speed you on to care. Hi, Denise. I'm so sorry to interrupt myself. Anyway. But if we're concerned not just about ourselves or our families, but if we're concerned about public health or others who may come along the cliff, we might think, what else could we do as a health intervention besides stationing lots of ambulances at the bottom of the cliff? So somebody in this audience might suggest a fence. I mean, not a fence, but maybe a net halfway down. A net to catch people as they fall so that they don't get crunched at the bottom. But we recognize that nets have holes in them, so some people will fall through the cracks. So maybe let's make that a trampoline instead. But even if we had a trampoline halfway down, you'll find people just bouncing up and down at half functionality, not really able to get back to the top of the cliff. So what about this fence? Let's put a fence at the edge of the cliff to keep people from falling off in the first place. But that's going to have to be a very, very strong fence if there's a lot of population pressure against it. So what else could we do as a health intervention? We could move the population away from the edge of the cliff. So I'm going to pause there for a minute to label these interventions that I've described so far. Clearly, the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff represents medical care, tertiary prevention, managing diabetes, that type of thing. The net or trampoline halfway down are our safety net programs and secondary prevention, screening. The fence at the top is primary prevention, keeping things from happening in the first place. And moving the population away from the edge of the cliff, that's what we are now describing as addressing the social determinants of health. So if we were thinking about infant mortality, babies dying before they're 1 year of age, then the ambulance might be our neonatal intensive care units. Our net or trampoline might be prenatal care. Our fence might be excellent maternal nutrition, and moving the population away from the edge of the cliff might be a living wage, so increased minimum wage, maybe it's excellent schools or that type of thing. This is a nice little diagram that I developed when I was in New Zealand to try to understand what the New Zealand government was doing in terms of Maori health. I've actually recommended that the CDC use this to figure out how are we spending our public health resources in this nation. And actually, it's been useful for engaging communities in discussions about how we should use our health resources. But so far, it has not yet addressed how health disparities arise, which is the social justice issue. So we're going to leave the cliff behind for a minute and turn to a discussion of how health disparities arise on 3 levels, and then come back to the cliff. How do health disparities arise? Well, especially when you're thinking about racial ethnic health disparities, we have a lot of evidence, unfortunately, about differences in the quality of care received within our healthcare system. And many of you may be familiar with the Institute of Medicine's Unequal Treatment Report, published about 6 years ago, that pulled together a lot of that evidence. But even that Institute of Medicine panel that did this scholarly report on differences in the quality of care, even that panel felt this is not the full answer because they were acknowledging that there are differences in access to healthcare in the first place. But before you even find people seeking healthcare, there are actually differences in our life opportunities and life exposures that are making some individuals and communities sicker than others in the first place. And when I think about these 3 levels at which health disparities arise, I think about it's really like a big pyramid or an iceberg, and the big base of it is the differences in life opportunities and life exposures that make some individuals and communities sicker than others. Then you have people seeking healthcare, and you have the insult of some people not being able to access the care they need. And then even the lucky ones who get within the healthcare system are sometimes further injured because of differences in quality of care. So now, remembering these 3 levels at which health disparities arise, we'll return to our cliff. But now we're going to recognize that we're really not dealing with a flat 2-dimensional cliff, but actually we're dealing with a 3-dimensional cliff. And at some parts of the cliff, there may be an ambulance there, but maybe it has a flat tire, so it's slow, or it goes off in the wrong direction. Or maybe there's no ambulance there at all, and maybe there's not a net nor a fence. And usually at those parts of the cliff, the population is closer to the edge. So now I'm going to label these observations about our 3-dimensional cliff with how health disparities arise. The differences in quality of care that we described, that's when the ambulance is slow or goes off in the wrong direction. The differences in access to care are no ambulance, no net, no fence. And the differences in underlying exposures and opportunities is the closer proximity of that population to the edge. Now, you'll remember that I described addressing the social determinants of health as moving the population away from the edge of the cliff. But now we have new questions now that we are recognizing that there's a three-dimensional cliff. And the first question is, why is the cliff three-dimensional? But given that it's three-dimensional, there are two other questions. Why are there differences in how resources are distributed along this cliff face? And why are there differences in who's found at different parts of the cliff? Why are the oranges back there and the greenies up here? And when you start asking these kinds of questions, this is not about addressing the social determinants of health, but about addressing the social determinants of equity, which are different kinds of things. They're now the forces and the structures that create the three-dimensionality and are distributing populations. And it's important for us actually to address the social determinants of health, to move the population away from the edge of the cliff. That means addressing things like poverty. But if we didn't realize that there was a three-dimensional cliff, we might actually make health disparities worse because we might move some of the population away from the edge of the cliff, but not all of the population away from the edge of the cliff. Another thing before we leave this cliff and before I say the same kind of thing in another way is, about 6 months ago I was doing this talk and I just recognized that there are three types of health intervention that are described now in our cliff. We have health services, which are the ambulance, net, and fence, which can actually be described in one dimension, along a line. At the moment that we start addressing the social determinants of health, then you get into a plane, a flat plane, because now you're going to move the population away from the edge of the cliff. At the moment that you acknowledge the three-dimensionality of cliff and start wanting to address issues of equity, you move into three-dimensional space. And I'll circle back to this notion, but I think that that is going to be one of our challenges in this nation, is to expand the conversation beyond the very important conversation that we're about to engage in about how do we get universal access to high-quality health care, which is this linear thing. But we're going to have to expand to also talk about addressing social determinants of health and social determinants of equity if we're really going to improve health outcomes in this country and eliminate health disparities. Now I'm going to say the same thing, not talking now about levels of health intervention, but talking about how do we think that health arises in the first place. What do we think of as the determinants of health? I also want to say before I carry on, at any point, even though this is a lecture, at any point, if you have something, a burning question or a challenge or an amen, shout them out, raise your hand, and I will entertain it. We'll have time for more discussion at the end, but I don't want to have anybody sitting for a long time holding a question. So is there anything that anybody wants to ask or mention about the cliff before I carry on? Okay. So now thinking about determinants of health. In this country, we are really focused a lot on individual behaviors as the determinants of health. That is, we're focused on thinking that if you're obese, it's because you didn't exercise enough or you ate the wrong kinds of foods or too much of it and that type of thing. And clearly, individual behaviors are important. But actually, even at CDC, a lot of our public health efforts have been about trying to educate people and change individual behaviors. So, eat 5 to 9 fruits and vegetables a day. Decrease your fat intake. Exercise 30 minutes at least 3 days a week. Control your alcohol intake. Don't smoke, da-da-da-da-da. All about individual behaviors. And we know these things are important. But now at CDC and around the country, people are saying, well, maybe individual behaviors are not so much a matter of just your individual choice. Maybe we have to start talking about these social determinants of health that I mentioned just a minute ago. And what are these social determinants of health? These are the determinants of health and illness that are outside of the individual. So they're beyond genetic predispositions and they're beyond individual behaviors, and they are in fact the contexts in which individual behaviors arise. So what are examples of these social determinants of health? Well, you have individual resources like education, occupation, income, and wealth. This is what we usually describe as individual social class. But you also have place-based or neighborhood resources like the quality of housing stock in a given neighborhood, or the food choices that are available to people, or public safety issues, transportation options. Are there parks and recreation where people can exercise? What about the political clout of different neighborhoods? These social determinants of health also include hazards and toxic exposures, which could be place-based or occupational group-based, like pesticides or lead, reservoirs of infection. And these social determinants of health or contexts also include opportunity structures. What is the quality of schools that's available? Are jobs available in this neighborhood? What is the justice system looking like on your side of town? So now we have these two levels of determinants of health. Not only does it matter what you put in your mouth, but we recognize now that what you put in your mouth may depend on the food choices available to you. So now these two levels of health, determinants of health, are important for us to address if we're really going to get some traction and try to achieve social justice in terms of health. But now I am actually challenging CDC and the nation to expand even beyond that social determinants of health bubble, because if the social determinants of health are the context, if they are our neighborhoods and our individual social class, then what determines the context? And here I've labeled these as the societal determinants of context. These are the things now where you're getting to the real mechanisms of social justice. These are the things that determine the range of neighborhoods. If neighborhood is important, what determines the range of neighborhoods in New Brunswick, or in New York City, or in Atlanta, Georgia, or anywhere? And furthermore, what determines who's found in each of these different neighborhoods? How are populations distributed to the different contexts? And now we're talking really about structures and systems of power, which include our economic system, capitalism, which we talk about in this country and which we have celebrated even without any question until recently. But it's our economic system which creates class structure because some people own the factories and other people work at them. These systems include racism, which I'm going to talk about in a little more detail in a minute, but that is a force which differentially distributes the population into the different social classes. And it includes other systems of power like sexism, heterosexism. All of these isms are systems of structuring opportunity and assigning value. They're systems of power. And these are what I was describing on the cliff as the social determinants of equity. So now we have three levels of determinants of health. Not only does it matter what you put in your mouth, and not only do we understand that what you put in your mouth is determined by whether there's a grocery store in your neighborhood or not, and whether or not they sell fresh fruits and vegetables. But then we have to say whether or not there's a grocery store in your neighborhood depends on these broader societal determinants of context, or these social determinants of equity, this broader outer ring, because the policies that are laid down in the decisions about zoning and that kind of thing impact that as well. And so we really are going to have to address all of these levels of health. We know a lot about individual behaviors. How do you address social determinants of health, that second ring? Well, addressing the social determinants of health clearly is going to involve the health sector, so medical care, the public health system. But it is going to have to extend beyond these because health is not created within the healthcare system. So it's going to involve collaborating with sectors outside of the healthcare system, including education, housing, labor, justice, transportation, agriculture, the environment, immigration, on and on and on. And this kind of collaboration is not going to be us at CDC, as the nation's public health agency, convening everybody at our health table and saying, oh, come to our health party. I mean, that might work once, but that's not going to work on the long term. It's actually going to mean that we as health people are going to have to go and sit at the education table and at the housing table, maybe for months at a time, and listen into these conversations and to identify the common interest. And I'd say, well, this is how we're thinking about this at CDC. So this is going to be important, and actually I think there is a move now to this kind of cross communication. It's hard when you're working in silos, and it's hard when the money comes to departments from Congress in silos, but we're working at that. Well, what about that final outer ring, addressing the social determinants of equity? How do you do that? First of all, it's going to involve monitoring for the three-dimensionality of the cliff. We're going to have to actually look to see not only disparities in outcomes, differences in the numbers of bodies